where faith, inspiration, and storytelling come together to bring the Bible to life like never before. Our mission is to take you on a spiritual journey through the Bible's stories, from the creation in Genesis to the revelations of the end times. Welcome to Timeless Bible Journeys.
Welcome to Timeless Bible Journeys, where we explore the deeper meanings behind some of the most profound biblical stories. If you enjoy thought-provoking discussions on faith, spirituality, and history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And now, let's take a journey into one of the most perplexing and powerful narratives in the Bible, the story of Abraham and Isaac. Why would a loving God ask Abraham to sacrifice his beloved son? This question has echoed through centuries, stirring deep debates on faith, obedience, and divine purpose. At first glance, the command seems almost incomprehensible, but beneath the surface lies a story rich with meaning, one that challenges our understanding of trust, devotion, and the nature of God Himself. Today, we'll explore 6 key perspectives that may shed light on this extraordinary test of faith. A test of absolute faith. The first and most widely accepted interpretation is that God was testing Abraham's faith. Genesis 22:1 begins with God tested Abraham. This wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was a deliberate examination of Abraham's trust in God's promises. Abraham had waited decades for a son, and Isaac was the fulfillment of a divine covenant. Yet, when asked to surrender what he loved most, Abraham obeyed without hesitation. His unwavering faith demonstrated that his trust in God was greater than his personal desires. This moment teaches us a profound lesson. True faith often requires us to trust even when we don't understand. Faith, by its very nature, is built on trust in the unseen. Abraham had already demonstrated faith when he left his homeland for a future he could not yet see. But this moment, this test, was different. It was the ultimate breaking point, the moment when his deepest love and God's command came into direct conflict. Would Abraham still trust God, even when it seemed that doing so would cost him everything? We often find ourselves in similar positions in life, facing situations where we must choose between our desires and our faith. The test of faith isn't just about belief in God's existence. It's about believing in His plan, even when it doesn't align with our understanding. Abraham's story serves as a reminder that faith isn't always about comfort or convenience. Sometimes, it requires us to step into uncertainty with complete trust. Imagine the weight on Abraham's shoulders as he journeyed with Isaac to Mount Moriah. Every step must have been agonizing, yet he continued forward. He bound Isaac, placed him on the altar, and raised the knife. This wasn't just an act of obedience, it was an act of surrender. Abraham had to come to terms with the reality that Isaac, his beloved son, ultimately belonged to God. And then, at the last moment, God intervened. The test was complete. Abraham had proven that his faith wasn't just in God's blessings, but in God Himself. The lesson here is clear. Faith is about trust, even in the darkest moments. It's about believing that God sees the bigger picture, even when we cannot. For Abraham, the test of faith wasn't about loss. It was about proving where his heart truly belonged. His faith was rewarded not just with Isaac's life, but with an even greater promise, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. This act of faith became the foundation of his legacy, an example of unshakable trust that would inspire generations. How do we apply this lesson to our lives today? We may never be asked to make the kind of sacrifice that Abraham faced, but we will all encounter moments that challenge our faith. When everything seems uncertain, when we're asked to let go of something we deeply cherish, can we still trust in God's plan? Abraham's story urges us to say yes, to step forward even when we don't have all the answers, and to believe that God will provide a way. A lesson in obedience. Closely related to faith is the concept of obedience. Abraham's immediate response, rising early, preparing the journey, and proceeding without protest, shows total submission to God's will. He didn't ask why. He didn't negotiate. He simply obeyed. Obedience is one of the most challenging aspects of faith. It requires not only trust, but also action. Many people believe in God, but not all are willing to follow His commands, especially when those commands seem to contradict human logic or personal desires. Abraham's story highlights a critical truth. Obedience often requires sacrifice. Throughout history, obedience to God has set people apart. Consider Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, or Noah building the ark despite never having seen rain. Their obedience shaped history. Abraham's obedience was no different. It demonstrated that true faith isn't just about belief, but about action. The journey to Mount Moriah was an exercise in complete submission. Every step Abraham took was a choice to trust in God's plan, no matter how difficult it seemed. This level of obedience is what set Abraham apart as the father of nations. It wasn't just about his belief. It was about his willingness to act on that belief. In our modern world, obedience to God can take many forms. Sometimes it means standing firm in our values when the world pressures us to compromise. Other times it means walking away from something we want because we know it isn't aligned with God's will. The lesson from Abraham's story is clear. Obedience is rarely easy, but it is always rewarding. When we obey God, we place ourselves in alignment with His greater plan. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac resulted in God's reaffirmation of His covenant, an extraordinary reward for an extraordinary act of trust. What does obedience look like in your life? Are there areas where you struggle to follow God's direction? Abraham's story challenges us to evaluate our own commitment. It asks us whether we too are willing to trust and obey, even when the path ahead is unclear. Foreshadowing of divine provision. But there's another layer to this story, one that hints at something much greater. When Isaac asks, "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham responds, "God will provide." And indeed, at the last moment, God provides a ram in Isaac's place. Many scholars see this as a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ, the ultimate sacrifice God would provide for humanity. Just as Isaac carried the wood for his own sacrifice, Jesus carried the cross. Just as Abraham was willing to give up his son, God would later give up His own Son for the redemption of the world. This moment is one of the most profound in biblical history. It illustrates God's mercy, His plan for salvation, and His unwavering love for humanity. The concept of substitutionary atonement, the idea that one can take the place of another, is fully realized in the New Testament through Christ's sacrifice. Abraham's faith in God's provision teaches us that when we fully trust in Him, He provides what we need. Sometimes, His provision doesn't come in the way we expect, but it always comes at the right time. When we walk in faith and obedience, God meets our needs, often in ways we couldn't have imagined. This powerful parallel between Isaac and Jesus emphasizes that God's plan is always bigger than we can see. Abraham trusted and God provided. Today we are called to do the same. Rejection of human sacrifice. Another perspective suggests that this story was meant to reject human sacrifice. In ancient cultures, child sacrifice was tragically common, but God intervened, stopping Abraham before he could harm Isaac. This dramatic moment made it clear: the God of Abraham is different. He does not demand human sacrifice. Instead, He values life and provides an alternative. This was a defining moment in the development of biblical faith, one that set it apart from the surrounding cultures. Human sacrifice was a widely accepted practice among pagan religions in the ancient Near East. Many gods were believed to require human offerings to appease their wrath or secure favor. However, through Abraham's experience, God demonstrated a stark contrast between himself and these false deities. The message was profound. God does not desire human blood, but rather faith, obedience, and trust in his divine provision. The rejection of human sacrifice in this story aligns with later biblical teachings. In Deuteronomy 12:31, God explicitly condemns the practices of neighboring nations who sacrifice their children to idols. Instead of demanding the life of Isaac, God provided a ram, foreshadowing the idea that God himself would ultimately provide the perfect sacrifice, not through human bloodshed but through his own divine intervention. This lesson has significant implications for how we view God's nature. Unlike pagan deities who were depicted as cruel, capricious, and bloodthirsty, the God of Abraham emerges as merciful, just, and compassionate. His test of Abraham was never about cruelty, but about demonstrating that true worship is not about destruction, but about devotion. In our modern world, the idea of literal human sacrifice may be obsolete, but there are still metaphorical sacrifices we make in pursuit of success, wealth, or power. Society often demands that we sacrifice our integrity, values, and even our relationships to achieve status. Abraham's story serves as a reminder that God does not call us to sacrifice what is most precious to us for worldly gain, but rather to trust in his provision. Ultimately, Abraham's willingness to obey was met with God's ultimate mercy. And in that moment, the foundational message was established. God provides a way, and his ways are always rooted in life, not death. Prioritizing God above all. Another perspective on this story is that God was teaching Abraham, and by extension all believers, that nothing should come before him. Isaac was not just Abraham's son. He was the embodiment of God's promise, the long-awaited miracle child through whom a great nation would be born. It would have been easy for Abraham to see Isaac as the ultimate fulfillment of his life's purpose, perhaps even placing him above his relationship with God. God's command to sacrifice Isaac forced Abraham to confront this question. Was he more attached to the blessing than to the one who gave it? This lesson remains relevant today. It's easy to let our dreams, relationships, careers, or material possessions become the center of our lives. Sometimes, we might even place these things above our relationship with God. But as this story illustrates, true faith means trusting that God's plans are greater than our own and that he must remain our highest priority. Consider the moment when Abraham lifted the knife. By that point, he had fully surrendered his will to God. It was not that God actually wanted Isaac's life. He wanted Abraham's heart. God wanted to see if Abraham was willing to give up the most precious thing in his life for the sake of his Creator. The moment Abraham proved his faith, God intervened and provided a ram, reaffirming his character as a provider and protector. This concept of prioritizing God above all is seen throughout the Bible. In the New Testament, Jesus teaches a similar principle in Matthew 10:37. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. This does not mean we should abandon our loved ones, but rather that our devotion to God must come first. When we put him at the center of our lives, everything else falls into place. Abraham's story challenges us to examine our own hearts. Is there something we are holding on to too tightly? A relationship, a dream, a sense of security? Are we willing to trust God with everything, even when we don't understand his plan? The story of Isaac's near sacrifice is not just about Abraham, it's about all of us. It invites us to reflect on whether we are willing to surrender all aspects of our lives to God's will. This is not to say that faith requires us to give up everything we love, but it does ask us to hold our blessings with open hands, recognizing that they ultimately belong to God. Just as God returned Isaac to Abraham, He often restores, blesses, or redirects what we surrender to Him in ways beyond our understanding. Ultimately, this story is a powerful reminder that God is the true source of all blessings, and our faith should not be in the gifts we receive, but in the giver Himself. Abraham's willingness to prioritize God above all else led to an even greater promise, that through him all nations would be blessed. And in our own lives, when we place our trust in God above all else, we open the door to His greater plans and purposes. The ethical and philosophical debate. The story of Abraham and Isaac has been the subject of intense ethical and philosophical discussion for centuries. The very idea of a divine command that appears to contradict moral intuition raises profound questions. Can faith ever justify an act that, under normal circumstances, would be considered morally reprehensible? How do we reconcile a loving God with such a severe test? And what does this story teach us about the nature of moral duty and divine authority? One of the most well-known philosophical interpretations of this story comes from the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. In his work, Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard explores the concept of the teleological suspension of the ethical. He argues that Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac represents a moment where faith transcends ethical norms. From a purely moral standpoint, killing one's child is indefensible. However, Kierkegaard suggests that Abraham's faith places him in a higher category, what he calls the knight of faith, who obeys God's command, trusting in a divine purpose beyond human comprehension. This perspective challenges us to consider the limits of human reason and morality when confronted with divine will. If God, as the ultimate source of morality, commands something that appears unethical, should one obey blindly, or is there room for questioning? Abraham does not argue with God in this instance, unlike in Genesis 18 when he pleads for the people of Sodom. This silence has led some scholars to suggest that Abraham's trial was not just one of obedience, but of trust. Trust that God's command, no matter how difficult, would not ultimately lead to injustice. However, critics of this interpretation raise serious concerns. Some argue that the story risks promoting blind obedience to authority, a notion that has historically led to dangerous consequences. If Abraham had been mistaken in believing God's command, would he have been morally culpable? Does faith ever justify actions that contradict ethical principles? These questions highlight the tension between faith and reason, a debate that continues in theological and philosophical circles today. Another perspective considers the ethical implications from the standpoint of divine testing. If God is all-knowing, He would already be aware of Abraham's faith and obedience. Why then would He require such a dramatic demonstration? Some scholars propose that the test was not for God's benefit but for Abraham's, to strengthen his faith and provide a lesson for future generations. In this view, the ethical dilemma is reframed. Rather than focusing on the morality of the command itself, the emphasis is on what the experience teaches about faith, surrender, and divine providence. This interpretation aligns with broader theological themes found in the Bible, where trials and hardships are often depicted as opportunities for spiritual growth. James 1:23 states, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance." Abraham's trial, then, serves as a model for believers who encounter their own moments of deep uncertainty and struggle. Modern thinkers have also examined this story through the lens of moral philosophy. Immanuel Kant, for instance, would likely oppose Abraham's decision on the grounds that moral law should be universal and based on reason, not divine command. Kant's ethical framework, known as deontology, asserts that certain actions, such as killing an innocent person, are always morally wrong regardless of the circumstances. This perspective challenges the notion that faith can override fundamental moral duties. On the other hand, utilitarianism, which assesses morality based on outcomes, might view Abraham's test differently. If one considers the broader consequences, Isaac's survival, the reaffirmation of God's covenant, and the ultimate lesson of faith, one could argue that the test was justified in light of the greater good it produced. Ultimately, the ethical and philosophical debate surrounding Abraham and Isaac's story remains unresolved, reflecting the complexity of faith and morality. The story forces us to wrestle with difficult questions. What does it mean to truly trust in God? Should moral duty ever be suspended for a higher, divine purpose? And how do we navigate the tension between faith, reason, and ethical responsibility in our own lives? Regardless of where one lands on these questions, the story of Abraham and Isaac continues to challenge and inspire, inviting deep reflection on the nature of belief, sacrifice, and the moral responsibilities that come with faith. The lesson for us today. The story of Abraham and Isaac is one of the most profound and challenging narratives in the Bible. It forces us to confront deep questions about faith, obedience, and the nature of divine testing. At its core, this story is about trust. Trust in God's plan, even when it seems impossible to understand. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac demonstrates a level of faith that goes beyond human reasoning. It is not just about blind obedience, but about surrendering to a higher purpose, believing that God's will is ultimately good. For believers today, this story serves as a powerful reminder that faith often requires us to step into the unknown. We may not face the same test as Abraham, but we all encounter moments when we must decide whether to trust God or lean on our own understanding. And whether it's a career decision, a relationship challenge, or a personal struggle, faith asks us to put our trust in something greater than ourselves. Furthermore, this story reassures us that God is a provider. Just as He provided a ram in place of Isaac, He provides for us in ways we may not always expect. The lesson is not about loss, but about faith in God's provision, His wisdom, and His timing. Ultimately, the narrative of Abraham and Isaac challenges us to examine our own faith. Do we trust God fully, even when the path ahead is uncertain? Are we willing to let go of our own plans in order to embrace Him? As we reflect on this ancient story, may we find the courage to trust, the wisdom to obey, and the faith to believe that God's purpose is always greater than our own. Thank you for joining us on Timeless Bible Journeys. If you found this discussion insightful, please like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking explorations of faith and history. Until next time, stay curious and stay faithful.